are insane people who have no criminal convictions, but who are, by anyone's standard, would be criminally insane. Even though only 15% of Americans have criminal records, roughly 90% of adult murderers have adult records, and that's exclusive of often extensive juvenile records. In other words, the kind of people who are committing gun violence are criminals, not law-abiding, peaceable people who happen to have their guns and all of a sudden they go berserk and commit violent acts. Most of these career criminals have adult crime careers of 6 years or more, including 4 major felonies. So the question, that comes out of this is, why are most of the proposals for gun control based at targeting law-abiding, peaceable people who obey the law, as opposed to criminals who are if they're going to commit murder, rape, robbery, some other sort of assault with a deadly weapon, they're certainly not going to worry about whether or not they lie on a federal 4473 form when they buy a handgun. They're certainly not going to worry about whether they get a gun on the street, whether they get a gun by stealing it from someone's home. In 2004, the National Academy of Sciences studied gun control, and they reviewed like 253 journal articles. The Academy couldn't identify any gun restriction that reduced violent crime, suicide, or gun accidents. In other words, those kinds of restrictions don't work. They are not efficacious. They don't reduce crime. Why are so many people trying to, pursue them? Because the real ways that affect violent crime are things that are much more difficult, much more complex, and much more expensive to address. They involve in prosecuting violent criminals to the fullest extent of the law, incarcerating them for long periods of time, and, where necessary, imposing the death penalty on people who are continuing to commit violent crimes in prison. Basically, those are much harder issues than it is to say, well, let's pass another gun control law, knowing that everyone who's law-abiding is going to obey that law, and people who aren't law-abiding are not going to be affected by it anyway. Where do criminals get their guns? There was a lot of talk about gun shows and how we need universal background checks to make sure that criminals don't acquire their guns at gun shows. Less than 2% of the guns that criminals acquire are acquired at gun shows. This is a 2004 survey of prison inmates. What they found was about 40% of the guns that those criminals acquire are from, quote, friends and family. By and large, that means other gang members. These people are committing crimes with guns, acquire them from other criminals. About 37.5% are from the street or on the black market. Yes, there is a black market in guns. About 11.5% are from licensed dealers. Well, people acquire them from licensed dealers who may not have may not be in the NICS system. The National Instant Check System is the database that's used when you go to buy a gun to check to see whether or not you're a prohibited possessor, either because you have a felony record or because you've been adjudicated mentally ill. Part of the problem is that not all of the states share this information with the federal government. It doesn't get into the NICS system. 23 states that have people who have been adjudicated mentally ill and have a record of violence, their names are not being put into the NICS system, into the database. So even if you had broader background checks, those people's names, unless they're in the system, it's not going to do you any good. And many of the people that we've seen who've committed mass murders were clearly mentally ill, violent, but they were able to acquire guns because their names weren't in the database. So we have to really fix the NICS system and make sure that those names are in the database before we can address that issues. And about 10% of the criminals' guns are acquired by theft. So basically, let me also talk for a minute about high-capacity magazines. I own high-capacity magazines, and I'm happy to say so. About a third of the violent crimes committed with guns against law-abiding, peaceable American citizens involve multiple attackers. If I'm home at night in my bed asleep and somebody tries to break into my house, as happened to me many years ago, which is one of the reasons I got involved with owning firearms and with the NRA, the people who plan those kinds of home invasions are going to have lots of time. They're going to have time to get whatever guns they want, whatever ammunition they want, multiple guns, multiple high-capacity magazines, whatever. What am I going to have as a homeowner, asleep, without any notice of this potential break-in, I'm going to have the gun that's there on my nightstand and whatever ammunition is loaded in it right there. So think about that. The reason that police officers in the military have firearms, semi-automatic firearms with high-capacity magazines, is because they need them to protect themselves. The reason that we as homeowners ought to be entitled to have those same protections is because we don't know. At least if you're a police officer or in the military, you know you're going into a fight. If I'm at home asleep alone, I don't know I'm going to be in a fight. Handguns are defensive firearms. They are not offensive firearms. They were designed to be small and carryable so that you could have them with you wherever you went to defend yourself. If you knew you were going to a fight, you would take a rifle, not a handgun. Rifles are offensive firearms. So, you know, basically criminals don't always give us even odds. And for me, being woken up in the middle of the night, even despite all the training I've had, I think my adrenaline would be pumping pretty hard. I'd be pretty scared. And if I had to defend myself, I'd want more than 7 rounds to do that. The NRA is not against gun laws. We have advocated for a lot of firearms laws that help prevent criminals from continuing on their crime sprees, keeping people in prison, making sure that criminals can't own guns, seriously prosecuting criminals, straw purchasers, for example, who buy guns for people who are prohibited possessors and wouldn't be entitled or able to buy them. So a lot of these things are things which the history of the NRA shows we've worked hard to make sure that A, people have safe firearms training and gun safety, marksmanship, safe and responsible handling of firearms, and obeying the law. NRA started the Hunter Safety Program way back when and turned it over to the state natural resources departments to make sure that firearms accidents dropped, and they are, in fact, today at an all-time low. We're in favor of strengthening trafficking laws to make sure that people can't traffic illegally in firearms. What we are trying very hard all the time to protect is the right of peaceable, law-abiding gun owners to have and exercise their Second Amendment rights for self-defense, and so that they can enjoy competitions and recreation as we've done for many, many years in this country. Let me point out one other thing. What gun control laws do is they tend to make violent crime increase. Why? Because when you disarm the law-abiding people, you make the criminal's job easier. During the first 5 years, California, by the way, has the strictest gun control laws in the country, or some of them at least. During the first 5 years, California's 1989 assault weapons ban, that the state's murder rate increased by 26%. Compared to 11% in the rest of the country. And during the first 5 years after California expanded the ban in 2000, the state's murder rate increased 10% compared to a 6% decrease in the rest of the country. Chicago is one of only 2 major cities to impose a handgun ban. Murder had been decreasing in Chicago since 1974, but in 1982, Chicago banned handguns, and in a decade, murders with handguns more than doubled. In 2011, Chicago had the 6th highest murder rate among major U.S. cities, behind Detroit, Baltimore, Philly, Memphis, and D.C., and its murder rate in Chicago is 5.6 times higher than the rate for the rest of Illinois. If having a lot of guns made places more dangerous in terms of gun violence, then the states with a lot of guns, Arizona being among them, would be a lot more dangerous, which it is not. What happens is when you ban guns, law-abiding people obey the law, and the criminals don't. So you basically disarm the law-abiding, make the criminal's job a lot easier. New York City is another good example. It had its own firearms registration law since 1967, on top of New York State's handgun licensing law that was imposed in 1911. But by 1990, the city's murder rate had risen to nearly 31 murders per 100,000 residents, which was more than triple the rate of the rest of the nation. What you'll find is the violent crime with guns rate is much higher in cities with diverse populations than it is in rural areas that tend to have more homogeneous populations. And that, in fact, is true throughout the rest of the country. Countries that have homogeneous populations, Switzerland's a good example, tend to have lower rates of crime with guns. And all Swiss children are taught to shoot at a very early age because there are so many firearms in Switzerland, and they're very concerned about safety. So I think it's important that we, A, look at the facts, B, look at public policy issues where we are trying to address a particular public policy issue, let's say a public safety issue. We need to make sure that we're looking at provisions that will work, that have actually shown to be efficacious, and not things which will simply get the proponents of gun control a place on the front page of the newspaper. Thank you.
I'll try to keep my eye on the time. What I find tremendously interesting about Ms. Froman's comments is that about 3/4 of them we agree on. We agree, for example, that Heller and McDonald were key cases. The point being, Heller was 2008, McDonald was 2010, after this band of anti-gun control folks got control of the Supreme Court. We agree that her position is advocacy, not philosophical investigation. How do I know that? Because the very first thing she said was, "I'd like to thank Professor Weinstein for agreeing to debate us." My purpose here is to debate the NRA, and I'm never going to be able to do that. And I'm never going to be able to do that because I'm not a statistician, I'm not a sociologist, I can't parse every study. What I can do is look at the things that she said here. For example, she said, most people who commit mass murders with guns are insane. No, all people who commit mass murder with guns are insane. By definition, most people who commit crimes with guns are criminals. No, all people who commit crimes with guns are criminals. There's a whole lot of wordplay going on here, including condemning the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times as if they're keeping this information from you. All of you are in college and university. You know what newspapers you look at. You know how easy it is to access that information. Up until about 2/3, the only thing that we disagree with was that airline pilots are wealthy, right? I mean, this is the #1 aviation school in the country. You know how poor airline pilots are. If they're collecting automatic rifles, it's because automatic rifles are so cheap that they can buy them at $24,000 a year salary. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Right, she points to California, and she says that after gun control laws, violence went up. She didn't talk about the economic collapse in California at the same time. She also talked about how diverse populations cause more violence. Be scared of different people. She didn't talk about the fact that in that period, California increased in diversity drastically so that it's the first state where Caucasians are the minority, right? She talked about how she wants, you know, the people who are coming into the house have time to plan and have guns. Now, I don't know the full story, but I watched a YouTube video of Ms. Froman telling the story of her home invasion, and if the story was complete, and I can't say that it was, the person who invaded her home with a screwdriver, and that she called a neighbor first, another neighbor second, and then the police. And the police came 15 minutes later, and the invader didn't get into the home. Now, we live in a scary place sometimes. If you look at this room right now, and you think about how easy it would be for someone to stand at that door with an automatic weapon with a high-capacity magazine, and how quickly they could kill all of us before any of us took out the concealed handgun that we're not supposed to have in this building, how many of us would die? It's very easy to make people afraid. What's hard is to look at the background, is to look at the complications, is to look at the history behind all of this stuff. And my point is not that we need to get rid of all guns, right? If there was an argument that she was making, the argument was the gun control folks are going after the wrong guns. If there was an argument that she was making the argument that handguns are dangerous, not automatic weapons. Well, maybe that's the case. Maybe we should focus on both. But focusing on automatic weapons is part of the compromise. It's part of the compromise that many of us are willing to make. She brought up that old saw about Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm going to ask you a question since she's asking you a question. How many of you know the story of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto? I suspect very few. How many of you know the details? So did it make a difference? Did it make a difference to the 6 million Jews who were exterminated or the millions of others? It didn't. Yes, they took a few people down with them as they went down. Now that's a moral commandment. When they come for me, I want to take as many of them with me. Now, if anyone threatened my 7-year-old daughter, I would hold that position too. I'd burn this town to the ground. But that doesn't mean that I'm right, and it doesn't mean that I'm entitled. It means that we have laws to protect people from the worst of ourselves. We have laws to make sure that we live in a civilized society. Do guns make us more civilized? No. Now, she talked about Switzerland. I already talked about Switzerland. She talked about how the NRA is in support of all of these laws. Did you know that the NRA was in support of all these laws? I didn't know the NRA was in support of all these laws. And I've been reading about the NRA in preparation for this, and in the New York Times, and the LA Times, and the Washington Post, and on Fox News. When somebody tells you that an organization that supports all things that you are surprised that they support, something's awry. Now, I am not going to make the argument that we should take away people's guns. It's impossible in the United States. I forget the exact figures. I can look it up. I think the military has 6 million guns. I think Americans have 60 million guns. But what I am going to say is that we have to rethink what we're doing. And we have to rethink the laws. She said, well, the problem is the registration system. Well, of course the problem is the registration system, because the NRA has spent millions and millions of dollars and decades to destroy the registration system. There is no way for the government to mandate an inventory in a gun shop. And there is incredibly high levels of theft in gun shops. Now, there are people who say it's because there's high levels of theft in gun shops. There are people who say that there is a huge percentage of guns that gun shop owners are giving people on the slide. I don't know which is true. I'm not qualified to know which is true. But I am sure that it's not a black and white issue. Laws don't stop criminals. So gun laws aren't going to stop criminals. That's true. Rape laws don't stop rapists. There are a handful of rapes on this campus every year. And we are a law-abiding people. Laws don't stop the people who are going to commit crimes. What they do is give people the tool to prevent, to prosecute, to respond, and to learn. One of the things that will happen as you all get older, and you may have seen this already, is you will encounter colleagues who have a reason to not do anything. Let's have a change in my department. Well, there's a colleague who tells us 1,000 reasons why it can't be done. Let's have a change in our marriage. Well, there's a spouse that tells us 1,000 reasons why it can't be done. Let's have a change in the society. Let's have a change in our community. Let's have a change in our education system. Let's have a change in our attitudes. There are 1,000 reasons why it can't be done. But the fact of the matter is, there are millions of reasons why it can be done, because we as a country have shown that we do the impossible every single day. For thousands and thousands of years, people thought that a society like America would be impossible, and it's not. We are incredibly safe right now in our society, despite paranoia by people like me with their kids who checks the locks and the door and the windows every night. I forgot the word stealing, not adoption, abduction. Child abduction rates have not increased since the 1960s. Do you know why I'm afraid? Because the news tells me to be afraid. There's no reason to be paranoid in this society. There's no reason to be afraid in this society. We are in a very stable, politically difficult, but very stable period in our society. It's time to stop listening to the people who say we can't do it and start listening to the people who have shown time and time again that we can. I can't fight the NRA, but what I can do is get you as students to have the opportunity to think critically of the message that's put in this room to you and ask you intuitively, based on what you believe, as you are facing in law school the hardest educational experience you've ever had, in undergraduate the hardest educational experience you've ever had, as you prepare for long-term relationships and raising families and fighting the political battles that you believe in, are you rather going to listen to the person who says you can't do it or the person who says you can? I am the person, the teacher of 20 years, who says that you can. Thank you.
It is always interesting when I do these debates that we agree upon a large number of things. We all agree that prohibited possessors, felons, shouldn't have firearms. We all agree that the mentally ill with violent tendencies shouldn't have firearms. I think what we don't agree upon is whether law-abiding, peaceable people ought to be able to have firearms for any lawful purpose that they want. And when Professor Weinstein says that, did the Warsaw Ghetto make any difference? And he says no, I say yes, it did. If you've ever been to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, you will see that it did. There's a lot of things in our history that have made a difference. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people who were involved in those survived. Does anybody know the answer to the question of when was the last time that the militia acted in defense of the country, as explained in the Second Amendment? Anybody want to venture a guess on that? 1812? Nope, it's a lot more recent than that, but thank you for guessing. All right, what is the militia as described in the Second Amendment? It's the unorganized militia. It's ordinary, everyday people who band together to protect their country. When was the last time that happened? And I will tell you all sitting here today, it was in your lifetime. September 11th. Does anybody remember what happened on Flight 93, United Flight 93? People had learned on their cell phones that that flight had been taken over by terrorists and was probably going to attack the nation's capital, the Pentagon, whatever. What do those people do? They got together, people who didn't know one another who were on that flight, they got together and they decided they were going to try to take over control of the plane and prevent it from attacking our country. They didn't have guns, didn't matter, but that was the militia. That was an example of the unorganized militia, people, ordinary people banding together to address a threat to their country. And you all know that the NRA was founded in 1871, right? Because Professor Weinstein said that. But does anybody know why? What the purpose of the NRA was? It was designed as a training organization. It was formed by Union officers who were very unhappy about the poor marksmanship of their soldiers during the Civil War, as compared, by the way, to the Southern Confederate troops who were used to shooting squirrels out of trees for the stew pots and were much better aim, especially at long distances. And these Union officers decided it was important to teach these young men marksmanship while they were civilians in case they ever got called up to defend this newly reunited country against a foreign invader. And as a matter of fact, since then, 85% of the NRA's resources have been spent on its original mission: training, firearms safety, making sure that young kids learn gun safety at an early age so they become safe, responsible gun owners, and we reduce the number of firearms accidents. And yet, what you really hear about NRA the most, and what you talk about when we have issues like this, is the political side of NRA, which it was sort of forced into after the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed, and there were huge restrictions on the rights of law-abiding firearms owners. You couldn't travel to another state to hunt with your firearm. You couldn't travel to another state to compete in a match with your firearm without running the risk of being prosecuted, especially if you had to travel through unfriendly states to get to where you were going. And that was fixed with the 1986 Act that NRA sponsored that removed a lot of those restrictions and basically made it possible to travel interstate with firearms for purposes of hunting and competitions and that kind of thing. Professor Weinstein said gun laws are not going to stop criminals. All I can say to that is amen. And that's a big point. They are not going to stop criminals. Who are they going to stop? They are going to stop law-abiding people like you and me who have no criminal intent, and we aren't the problem. And already, everything that has been done in these mass killings is already against the law, and those people are being prosecuted. I was in Springfield, Missouri the other day. Do you know who's in Springfield, Missouri in a facility for the criminally insane? Jared Loughner, the man who shot Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who, by the way, was my congresswoman. That's where I live in Tucson, Arizona. That's the Safeway I shop at. That's the Walgreens where I pick up my prescriptions. I wasn't there that Saturday morning, but that strikes pretty close to home. One of my very dear friends, a federal district court judge, John Roll, was killed in that shooting. I knew a number of people who were there that morning. Some of them were armed legally in Arizona with their concealed carry permits. They said that all happened so fast, by the time they got outside the store, it was all over. And yes, there were unarmed people who tackled that criminal, Loughner. And what they talked about was the fact that they knew when he was reloading that he was out of ammo. And that's why they were able to tackle him at the time. Mass murders, on average, the ones that you see in the paper all the time, account for approximately 35 killings per year. So why is it, when we have a lot of other deaths and killings, especially in cities like Chicago and New York, that people get very emotionally involved with this issue, but not so emotionally involved with the problems of poverty, the problems of no jobs, those kinds of things, which are leading to a lot of these people committing these crimes. That's what we should be addressing, not the rights of law-abiding citizens. As I say, everything that we're talking about when we talk about passing new laws is already against the law. There are 10,000 firearms laws on the books. And if you point to any one of these mass shootings, you'll find out that those laws were violated in any one of those cases. What you often don't hear about in the newspaper, you certainly don't hear about what NRA's been in favor of, because most of the big media won't talk about what the NRA has done or is willing to do. As a matter of fact, when I first joined the NRA Board of Directors 20 years ago, the NRA was trying to buy advertising in the New York Times and the Washington Post. They refused to sell advertising to the NRA. So when you say, well, why don't you read about it in the big newspapers? Well, that's part of the reason you don't. They won't even sell us advertising. And I encourage people, I say, if you want to hear the other side of the story, join the NRA. Get the newsletter, get the magazine, hear what the other side of the story is, and make up your own minds. I agree with Professor Weinstein. You need to hear both sides of the story. Not all of us get our information from more than one source. I would really encourage you to do that. I think that there's a lot more information out there today than there was even 5 years ago about firearms laws, about firearms public policy. There's lots to read. Much of it's available free on the internet, and I would encourage you to do that. There was a great book published about 15 years ago called The Samurai, the Mountie, and the Cowboy, which compared the firearms laws in a lot of different countries, including the United States, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, I think, and several others. It won the prize for the best criminology book of the year from the American Society of Criminology. And basically the theme of the book is that the presence of guns or the type of gun control laws have less to do with gun crime than the homogeneity of the population. in states or in countries, in this case, where the population is very similar, where people grow up with the same values, with the same culture, with the same respect for authority, they're much less likely to commit crime with guns. One of the things that's happening in Switzerland now, because I've shot in 2005 and 2010 in the Swiss federal rifle matches over there. And one of the things that's happening there is they have the Swiss, in a country of about 7.5 million people, every 5 years they have a national shooting match sponsored by the federal government. And about 50,000 people shoot in this match. Can you imagine in the United States a match with 50,000 competitors? But in Switzerland, that's what they do. What's happening in Switzerland now is with basically a lot of people from other countries coming into Switzerland, which has been relatively crime-free, especially violent crime, is now getting more and more crime, and they refer to it as being committed by criminal tourists. In other words, people who are coming to Switzerland from other countries. So, as I said, I would encourage you all to read about this issue and to write about this issue. You know, as far as legal topics go, constitutional law topics, this is still very new. It's not like the First Amendment where there's such a huge wealth of literature on this. On the Second Amendment, it's still a relatively open field. There's a lot of material to read. If you go to the Heller case, the opinion in Heller, you can find a lot of those materials that were cited in Heller. Go back and read those source materials. And then I would encourage you all, listening to what you heard today, to write about this subject. Whatever side you pick, I think you'll find it very interesting and informative, and you may change your mind. You may be in favor of gun control. You may decide that you kind of tend towards the other way, or you may be against gun control, and after reading and writing on this subject, you may feel yourself moving in the other direction. Regardless, you are all, those of you who are law students here, going to be lawyers and judges, and your input is important for the development of Second Amendment jurisprudence. So thanks again. Questions?
Yeah, we'll do questions. Thank you very, very much to both of our speakers. I think it went very well. We have 2 mics. Please talk into the mic if you have questions, because this is recorded. And we'll do about 5 to 10 minutes of questions. One moment.
I have a question for the former president. I'm not sure how well prepared you are for this question, since it just kind of popped in my head at the end of your last 10 minutes, but you say that most gun control laws only harm law-abiding citizens, and that the problem is homogeneity and common values that societies hold. Why wouldn't the NRA then cut off focus for gun control laws and not advocate for more education in like the inner cities and the urban populations?
The NRA does advocate for more education. As I mentioned, 85% of our resources are spent training, education, trying to basically inform people about, A, inform them about their rights, B, provide safety training like hunter safety classes or basic firearms safety classes and marksmanship. We have an affiliated organization called the NRA Foundation, and something like 92% of the grants that are made by that are for youth safety and education programs, 4-H, Boy Scouts, FFA, groups like that. I mean, we try to make sure that people are safe, responsible firearms owners. That was the really, part of NRA's original purpose, and something that we still do. You may not hear about it. I meet people all the time, and they say to me, why doesn't the NRA do this, or why doesn't the NRA do that? And I'll say, well, we do. And their question is, well, why don't we hear about it? And I say, well, you're not going to get most of the national media to say good things about the NRA.